3 innocent boys rode their bikes into the woods and never came back. What police discovered in the muddy creek behind Robin Hood Hills would ignite a media frenzy, terrify a small town, and lead to one of the most controversial trials in American history. But as 3 local teenagers were arrested, accused of satanic ritual murder, and dragged into a courtroom, a chilling question began to rise. Did the justice system rush to judgment just to calm the fear and lock up the wrong boys forever? This is Dark Motives, real crimes, real consequences. Today we're diving into the disturbing case of the West Memphis 3. It's a case that begins with the disappearance of 3 young boys and unfolds into one of the most controversial murder trials in American history. What followed was a storm of panic, pressure, and public outrage. And at the center of it all were 3 teenagers, accused of committing a crime so brutal, the entire country watched in horror. Let's get into it. West Memphis, Arkansas, 1993. A small, working-class town just across the Mississippi River from Memphis, Tennessee. Quiet, southern, and deeply religious, it was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids played outside until sunset. But underneath the surface there was tension, poverty, fear, and a growing sense that something dark was creeping into their community. The victims were 3 second-grade boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. All just 8 years old, all classmates, all full of energy and curiosity, the kind of kids who rode bikes barefoot and came home with pockets full of rocks and grass stains on their jeans. Stevie was bright and outgoing, a natural leader. Michael was a Cub Scout, disciplined and adventurous, and Christopher, the most mischievous of the 3, was known for being funny, loud, and sometimes hard to handle. But they were all loved. They were sons, grandsons, neighbors, and in a town like West Memphis, everybody knew their names. May 5th, 1993, started like any other day. The boys went to school, came home, and asked their parents for permission to go out and ride bikes together in their neighborhood. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just 3 kids being kids. But that would be the last time their families ever saw them alive. The last known sighting of the boys was around 6:30 p.m. on May 5th, 1993. They were seen riding their bikes near the edge of their neighborhood, heading toward a wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills, a dense, muddy patch of forest that sat between a residential area and the nearby Blue Beacon truck wash. It was a place local kids often played in, despite parents warning them to stay away. It was quiet, overgrown, and isolated, the kind of place that could swallow secrets. When evening came and the boys hadn't returned home, their families began to worry. By nightfall, panic had set in. Parents started knocking on neighbors' doors, calling friends, and driving around the neighborhood with flashlights. At 9 p.m., the police were contacted. Officers responded quickly, but their initial search was brief and largely unorganized. They treated it as a case of 3 boys simply wandering off. A few officers walked the edges of the woods but didn't go in far. There was no Amber Alert system in place at the time, and the seriousness of the situation hadn't fully registered yet. As darkness fell, so did a heavy silence. Volunteers joined the search. Flashlights swept across ditches, drainage canals, and empty lots. But the woods were thick, the creek was deep, and no one really knew where to look. Some parents feared the boys might have been hit by a car. Others whispered about something worse, a kidnapping or a predator. But no one could have imagined what would actually be found the next day. Before I tell you what searchers found the next morning, and how it shattered this town forever, make sure you're subscribed. If true crime stories like this keep you up at night the way they do me, you're in the right place. I post new cases every day here on Dark Motives. Raw, real, and always respectful to the truth. Now, let's go back to that creek. On the afternoon of May 6, 1993, nearly 24 hours after the boys vanished, a juvenile parole officer helping in the search spotted a black sneaker floating in a drainage ditch near Robin Hood Hills. It was tangled in the muddy water beneath a drainage pipe. What happened next would traumatize every single person involved. One by one, the bodies of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers were pulled from the shallow, murky creek. They were naked, beaten, and bound with their own shoelaces, wrists tied to ankles. Their bikes were found submerged nearby. It was a scene no one in that town would ever forget. The condition of the bodies only deepened the horror. Christopher Byers appeared to have suffered injuries far worse than the others, including mutilation in his lower body. Some immediately assumed this had to be the work of a sadistic killer, possibly someone involved in occult rituals. Panic swept through West Memphis like wildfire. Rumors of satanic activity had already been swirling in parts of the country during the early 90s, and now, to many residents, this case seemed to confirm their darkest fears. But there were still so many questions. Why were the boys targeted? Was it someone they knew? Or was it a random act of pure evil, and with no clear suspects and no evidence pointing in any direction yet? Fear began turning into pressure. The town wanted answers. The police needed someone to blame. The investigation began immediately, but from the start, it was overwhelmed by emotion, pressure, and a desperate need for results. West Memphis police had never handled a case like this, a triple child homicide. The crime scene had been contaminated within hours, with officers and volunteers walking through the water, collecting items with bare hands, and failing to preserve critical evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses, just fear. Under pressure from the public and media, detectives started focusing less on physical evidence and more on a theory. They believed the murders had ritualistic elements. The binding, the nudity, the brutal injuries, especially Christopher Byers' mutilation, were seen as signs of satanic involvement, and once that idea took hold, it became the lens through which the entire case would be seen. That's when the names of 3 local teenagers entered the conversation: Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly. They were outcasts, poor, labeled as troublemakers. Damian, in particular, stood out. He wore black clothes, read about witchcraft, and had a reputation for being different. In the eyes of many, that made him dangerous. But what they lacked in evidence, they tried to make up for in narrative. On June 3rd, less than a month after the murders, police brought in 17-year-old Jesse Miskelly for questioning. Jesse had an intellectual disability and struggled to keep up in school. For over 12 hours, officers interrogated him, without a lawyer or his parents present. Parts of that session were recorded, but much of it wasn't. And in the end, Jesse confessed. He said he, Damian, and Jason had taken the boys into the woods and killed them as part of a satanic ritual. The confession was full of contradictions, wrong times, wrong locations, and impossible details. But to the police, it was enough. Within days, all 3 teens were arrested for capital murder. There was no physical evidence linking them to the crime scene, no eyewitnesses, just a forced confession, and a community desperate to believe the nightmare was over. The trials of the West Memphis 3 drew national attention, and with each passing day, the cracks in the case became harder to ignore. Jesse Miskelly's confession, the only real evidence tying the teens to the murders, was filled with factual errors. He said the boys were killed in the morning when they were still in school. He gave wrong descriptions of how the victims were tied, and he was fed information by investigators throughout the interrogation. Even more disturbing, forensic experts began to question the so-called satanic elements of the crime. What had first been described as ritualistic mutilation was later suggested by some pathologists to be post-mortem animal activity, likely from turtles in the water. The horror was still real, but the motive was collapsing. And then came the biggest twist of all. New DNA testing, years later, would reveal that none of the genetic material found at the scene matched Damian, Jason, or Jesse. In fact, a hair recovered from the crime scene was consistent with the stepfather of one of the victims, a man who had never been seriously investigated at the time. Suddenly, the question wasn't just whether the West Memphis 3 were guilty. It was whether Arkansas had locked away 3 innocent teenagers, while the real killer walked free. Despite the growing doubt and lack of physical evidence, Damian Eccles was sentenced to death. Jason Baldwin received life without parole. Jesse Miskelly also got life. 3 teenagers, one of them barely 16, were condemned for a crime that, by now, many believed they didn't commit. For years they sat in prison as advocates, celebrities, and legal teams fought to prove their innocence. The case became a lightning rod for criticism of the American justice system, especially when it came to class, fear, and flawed evidence. Then, in 2011, after 18 years behind bars, a deal was offered. Known as an Alford plea, it allowed the three men to be released while still technically maintaining their convictions. In the eyes of the court, they were guilty, but they were free. It was a compromise that brought no real closure, not for the families, not for the town, and certainly not for the victims. To this day, no one else has been charged. The DNA evidence has never led to a new arrest. And though the West Memphis Three walk free, the case remains a haunting example of what happens when fear outweighs facts. And justice takes a back seat to public pressure. Three little boys, Stevie, Michael, and Christopher, never made it home. Their families never got real answers. And the town of West Memphis was left with a wound that never fully healed. What happened in those woods was horrifying. But what happened afterward exposed something even darker. How fear, stereotypes, and a rush to judgment can destroy innocent lives. Damien, Jason, and Jesse lost nearly 2 decades behind bars. But the person, or people, who actually committed this crime, still unknown, still unpunished. So now I want to hear from you. Do you believe the West Memphis Three were innocent? Should this case be reopened? And if so, who do you think really killed those boys? Let me know your theory in the comments. If this case made you question everything about justice, wait until you hear the story of 2 brothers who admitted to killing their own parents and claimed it was self-defense. The Menendez brothers' case shocked the nation, not just because of the crime, but because of what came out during the trial: family secrets, abuse, lies, and a courtroom that became a battlefield over truth, trauma, and survival. Click the video on your screen now to watch that case. Trust me, it's even more disturbing than it sounds. This is Dark Motives. Stay curious, stay questioning, and stay with us.